that famous, I want to call very famous line that Jesus uses in the Gospel of John is one that I believe we ought to keep in front of us at all times. It was not you who chose me, it was I who chose you. I think, as I said last week, too often we forget the fact that, we're not the ones who approached God. It was God who approached us first. It was God who said to you, each and every one of you, I choose you, I want you, I desire you for myself. And that's how it starts. That's where it belongs. And how often we act in such a way as if God owes us something because we were, good enough to get up on a Sunday morning and show up at church. God owes me something. No, that's not the case. We owe him. And I think we need to remind ourselves again and again and again of that very fact that God chose us for himself. Now, with that in mind, I want you to just think for a few moments about some of the great saints that maybe you know about. Think of some of every saint's life that you read, for the most part, shows at some point a radical shift in their life. You can look at all the good saints, but the one that I really want to focus on today is St. Paul. Now think about St. Paul. We know a lot about St. Paul. Half the New Testament is attributed to St. Paul. But what about the St. Paul before he was St. Paul, when he was still Saul? Who was this man who went around killing Christians? He was literally killing Christians. He was rounding up Christians in large numbers and bringing them to be killed. Think about this man for a second. I don't want this irony to slip past. Think about this man. How could he have been, first off, how could any human being have been so entrenched in their thinking, so overwhelmed in their thinking, that they believe that it's a righteous thing to destroy other human beings? Now, it's not like that's disappeared, because it's still out there. We have it a lot in our world. But this man, what was it that he was thinking? What was it that he believed that made him so self-righteous that he believed that Christians needed to be exterminated from the face of the earth? I'm going to use a bit of a charged word, and I don't mean it to be charged the way it is today, but use words like he was indoctrinated in a particular way of thinking. The culture of his time, the people of his time, the circles that he kept around him, the conversations that happened, the verbiage that's used over and over again cultivates within a person a worldview, a way of thinking, an approach, if you will, to what needs to be done. Now, if I could only imagine if things like social media had existed in St. Paul's time, what he would have been posting every time he killed another Christian. But think about it for a second. He was convinced. He was so convinced that he was right, that what he was missing is he was one of God's chosen, just like you. He was one of God's special, chosen disciples. And when it did happen, he was on the road to go kill Christians when he was heading to Damascus. When it happened, his entire world changed. His entire outlook changed. Even the way he lived his life and what he did changed. As one of my professors had said in the seminary, when St. Paul was on the road to Damascus and Jesus approached him, from that point on, he looked at life through Jesus-colored glasses. And you can see it in his letters. You can see how convinced he is from that one encounter of Jesus Christ, how convinced he is that proclaiming Jesus Christ risen from the dead, proclaiming this Jesus as Lord and Savior, proclaiming this Jesus as the source and font of eternal life was all that mattered. He went from persecutor of Christians to leader of Christians. We call that a conversion. or for some of us who were baptized as infants, a reversion. See, the problem I think we're encountering a lot today is people come, you sit here in the pews, but have you really encountered Jesus Christ? Have you really had that encounter with the Lord? So much so that it convinces you that this is the most important thing ever. And that, I believe, sometimes is the struggle that we have, because we do live in a culture. We do live in a community. We do live in a world. And to whom are we listening? To whom do we give our attention the most? Now, make no mistake, God chose you. You're here, and even after St. Paul's big conversion moment, he still needed to continue to grow in the grace that he received. He still needed to continue to understand what happened and what his role was and how he was going to do it. But there was one thing that was for sure. Even with all the growth he was doing, he was convinced. He knew that he now was called by Christ to be an apostle for Christ, to spread the good news of Christ. Are you convinced? God chose you, but are you convinced? Are you really, truly convinced? Or are you so influenced by the world around you that it's hard to hear the voice of God? I know what it's like because I've been there. I've been there many a time. So many conflicting things that I'm hearing, so many conflicting things that I'm seeing, so many voices speaking, and I'm not sure if I'm hearing the voice of God. And yet I know God chose me, and I should be listening more carefully. This 5th chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans is a beautiful chapter. Heard some of it last week, heard it again this week. Did you catch it? This is the man who's saying, everything that I've received from Christ is completely unmerited. His love, his gift was so much greater than the transgression. He's even going to the point of saying, look, I know I'm unworthy. I was a terrible person. But for the grace of God, I am who I am. I am the person that God has called me to be. And I'm going to live as God's chosen, and I'm going to do what I need to do, despite the fact that I am a wretched sinner. I am a wretched sinner. I've said it before, you got to say it out loud once in a while. You got to embrace it. You got to name it. Because if we can't, then we can't look to Jesus for the answer. I am a wretched sinner. I am a horrible, terrible sinner. But thanks be to God, Jesus Christ changed that and gave me the possibility of accepting grace. Totally unmerited, totally, no matter what, that grace that he wants to offer to each and every one of us. But it's also a grace of conversion. And so, is my life any different than my secular humanist neighbor? Is my life really, on the outside, any different than the way the atheists live? That's kind of what St. Paul is going to get at in the letter. Am I a member of Jesus Christ? Am I immersed in Jesus Christ or not? I love looking at the life of St. Paul because he is so radically different before than after. He changed. We've got to break a cycle in the Catholic Church that's come about. We've had bad catechesis for a while. We as a church have not done a really good job of immersing people in the faith, and that's why you're seeing so many things start to pop up today. Things like Formed. If you're not unformed in this parish, get unformed and start watching some of the content, listening to some of the great podcasts, hearing others in their conversion, people like Dr. Scott Hahn. His conversion story is one of the best I've heard for anybody that sits in the pew regularly. He's such a wonderful speaker, and he's such a gifted individual who came to the Catholic Church later in life, not like all of us, for the most part, who were baptized as babies. What a wonderful story he has. People like Chris Stefanik are on there. There's so many wonderful speakers. And start listening and hearing and changing your perspective. I know a lot of you love to sit in front of your TVs and watch that nightly news, and that's probably the most poisonous thing you can do. The poison that they are putting in your soul is going to kill you. I can't say it any other way. So try to replace it with something that will help you, not hurt you. Something that will convince you, not leave you in doubt. Because the one thing the devil loves is fear and doubt. And what do you get from the nightly news? Fear and doubt. And that's why Jesus is so beautiful today. I love his words that he's giving. We're in a beautiful section of all of Matthew's gospel. I do love all of Matthew's gospel. But we're in a really nice section where Jesus is saying, fear no one. Now, you know that there's different types of fear. There's that servile fear, that fear of the unknown, that fear of being hurt or being lost or being, all that fear that paralyzes. Fear no one, Jesus says, but fear the one who can cast body and soul. Fear the one. That's that loving fear, that respectful fear. The kind of that respectful fear I had for my father growing up. I knew he loved me. I knew he cared about me. I knew my mother loved me. And yet there was still that respectful fear, because that is a healthy kind of a fear. It's not a paralyzing fear. I didn't run from my parents, and so too with God. So too with God. God chose you. He wants you for himself. But if we truly appreciated who this Jesus Christ is, if we truly, like St. Paul, appreciated who God really is, there would be that respectful fear. Approaching this altar in a little while for Holy Communion should have a little bit of that fear and awe going on inside of you. Every single time we approach the altar, we were chosen, but we have to remember it's a fragile choice that God made. He knows that we're wretched sinners. He knows it, and he wants to do something about it. So let's do something about it. We have a couple of more weeks of reflecting upon this, and I think it's so important before we get into Matthew's parables. I think it's so important that we start working on that change of perspective, of breaking the cycle of indoctrination from a lot of what we immerse ourselves in, of encountering personally and really directly Jesus Christ. I can point to a particular day and time. I can point to a couple of specific events in my life where I can say that's when the change began. Like St. Paul said on the road to Damascus, so too you. Point to a day and time, and if it's not there, ask God for it. Say to God, I really want to experience your presence intimately and directly. And he will provide. He will do it, despite your wretchedness, despite your unworthiness, despite your perspective. He can cut right through to the middle of it and let you know you are chosen. Each and every one of you are not here by accident. God wanted you here. Now the only thing you have to walk out of here today to figure out is, if he chose you, what did he choose you for? As we all have a different purpose and a different meaning of how to spread the good news, you have to answer that question in your prayer with God. And so go away today with that sense that God does care about you, God does love you, God does need you to approach him, but that he has spoken your name and said, I chose you. Now you go forth and bear fruit. God bless you.